Hello, I'm Deacon Kathy Johnson and I'm a Methodist deacon in the Richmond and Hounslow circuit. And I have great privilege in having been asked to lead the Bible study this Sunday, the 22nd of November 2020. It's at 7 o'clock and it's on Zoom. So if you want to join us and you don't have the contact details, then you can contact Geoffrey Farrer, Reverend Geoffrey Farrer, and he will give you the relevant link. We are going to be looking at Isaiah 61, and that's 1 to 11, the whole chapter. And I've chosen this as part of our God is with us theme for just prior to Advent. You may think you know Isaiah pretty well, perhaps you do. It is smattered all over our lectionary, and we are always reading little snippets of it that we always relate to our understanding of our Christian relationship with God and with Jesus. But of course this was written in the Old Testament, and so the purpose of this particular session now is to perhaps go over a little more of the context of where it is in the Bible, what it's contemporary with, who it relates to, and putting it back into where it is in the Old Testament so that we can look at it afresh. And it's a long book. So we're just going to look at chapter 61. So there's been a bit of controversy as to how many people actually had input into this book. I think it's basically agreed that chapters 1 to 39 are about the very first person mentioned in verse 1 of chapter 1, who is Isaiah, son of Amos, not Amos, Amos. And those first 39 chapters follow his life and chronicle it. So it's either maybe written by him or somebody who worked with him or knew him. But after that, chapter 40, it's a little bit more controversial as to who's written it. Some people say it's written by several different people, others that it's just by one, others that it must have been written by the original Isaiah. But when you read it, and especially in the passage that we are looking at on Sunday, there just seems to be voices from later on, because Isaiah, son of Amos, was around at around 700 BC. And that is prior to the exile that Jessica was talking about last week when we looked at Lamentations. But some of the comments in the later and the way the visions are related later on in the book seem to have voices coming through from that time. Whereas Isaiah, son of Amos, dated from the time when Judah and Israel were split into two. And at that point, Judah, where Isaiah was, had not yet gone into exile. So let's put that into context a bit, into history. So Isaiah, son of Amos, was sent to the southern kingdom of Judah to prophesy. So his time as a prophet saw civil war between Judah and Israel. Israel was the northern kingdom. And that civil war was around 734. Then the Assyrians completely destroyed Israel, the northern kingdom, and took everyone off into exile and took all their major people with them. And then Isaiah was concurrent with 4 kings in Judah, which is the southern kingdom. And it seems that he was a courtly prophet, that he had the ear of the king, because it's quite clear from the very start that he was around and spoke to Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz and Hezekiah, 4 kings in a row. So I've looked a little bit for this session on where we know more about these kings, because they're mentioned there, and Hezekiah is noted quite a lot in this book of Isaiah, but they also appear in 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, and so we know we have a cross conversation telling us about these particular kings. So in 2 Kings, that particular era is covered from chapter 15 to around chapter 21. And all these 4 kings are noted as being quite young when they take over. So Uzziah comes first. He was 16 when he took the throne. And 2 Kings tells us that he was faithful to God despite having leprosy in later life. 2 Chronicles tells us about the same king in chapter 26 and says that he was a very successful king, and he beat the Philistines, but his power led to pride. So both these books agree that King Uzziah eventually became old and frail and had leprosy, but one just notes it and says that he was faithful to God despite his disease, and the other one says, well, he became very powerful and prideful, and that's why he was given leprosy. So that's an interesting different view of Uzziah. Then he was succeeded by Jotham, who governed while his dad was still alive, and then took the throne at the age of 25, so still quite young. And we're told he was faithful to God too. But neither he nor his father destroyed the pagan shrines. And the writers are quite adamant that they must tell us this, that although they were faithful to God, they tolerated other religions, pagan religions. So Jotham rebuilt the temple, and we are told in Chronicles that he also beat the Ammonites. So Chronicles is quite keen to tell us who beats who. Then they were succeeded by Ahaz, and he took the throne at the age of 20, but things seem to have gone rather downhill at that point. And we're told he followed Israel's lead, and of course Israel had recognised other gods, and then for their sins or whatever, they were overrun by foreign powers. So he agreed with the pagan practices. There's a bit of a confusing comment in both Chronicles and Kings about him putting his sons to the fire. I'm not quite sure what that means. And also, he then went into negotiations with Assyria to try and appease Assyria. And so the writers of 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles are rather despairing of this, because it shows that he would rather follow other gods than remain true to the one true God. And then we're told about Hezekiah. So Hezekiah appears quite considerably in the book of Isaiah, but also chapter 18 to 20 in 2 Kings and chapters 29 to 32 in 2 Chronicles, because he tried to bring the country back to a faithful following of God. And we're told that Assyria besieged the reservoirs in the country, but did not succeed, because Isaiah intervened, talked to God, and plague hit the enemy camp, and the whole army was completely decimated by plague. So that puts it into context historically. That's where Isaiah was. Isaiah was talking to the kings throughout that entire period and trying desperately to make sure that people understood what God wanted from them. We also tend to read our Bibles and think that all the different books follow one another chronologically. But actually, Isaiah was contemporary to Micah, Amos, and Hosea. So Micah was in Israel and Judah at around the same time, and he was busy denouncing oppression, pride, greed, false piety, and arrogance. Amos was in Israel at the time. Although he came from Judah, he was sent to Israel, and he denounced social sin, injustice, political corruption, greed, and false worship. And then Hosea was also based in the northern kingdom in Israel. His unhappy home life reflected symbolically what he saw happening around him in his nation. And so a lot of his words are about love of God versus waywardness of the nation. So that's where Isaiah stands compared to the others. But when we read Isaiah, particularly passages like the one we're going to be reading on Sunday, we read them through the lens of Christianity. And in fact, we're encouraged to by Jesus, because Jesus quoted Isaiah a lot, and particularly this passage in chapter 61, because in Luke 4, he reads the passage and then sits down and says that the reading is fulfilled in him. So this makes our reading of it coloured, I think, by what we think back into it. So when you read this passage, I'll read it to you now. and see what you think of it and whether there are any words that jump out on you as I'm reading. I'll read it quite slowly and give you a chance to take it in. Chapter 61 of Isaiah. The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is upon me, for the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to comfort the brokenhearted and to proclaim that captives will be released and prisoners will be freed. He has sent me to tell those who mourn that the time of the Lord's favour has come, and with it the day of God's anger against their enemies. To all who mourn in Israel, he will give a crown of beauty for ashes, a joyous blessing instead of mourning, festive praise instead of despair. In their righteousness they will be like great oaks that the Lord has planted for his own glory. They will rebuild the ancient ruins, repairing cities destroyed long ago. They will revive them, though they have been deserted for many generations. Foreigners will be your servants. They will feed your flocks and plough your fields and tend your vineyards. You will be called priests of the Lord, ministers of our God. You will feed on the treasures of the nations and boast in their riches. Instead of shame and dishonour, you will enjoy a double share of honour. You will possess a double portion of prosperity in your land, and everlasting joy will be yours. For I, the Lord, love justice. I hate robbery and wrongdoing. I will faithfully reward my people for their suffering and make an everlasting covenant with them. Their descendants will be recognised and honoured among the nations. Everyone will realise that they are people the Lord has blessed. I am overwhelmed with joy in the Lord my God, for he has dressed me with the clothing of salvation and draped me in a robe of righteousness. I am like a bridegroom in his wedding suit, or a bride with her jewels. The sovereign Lord will show his justice to the nations of the world. Everyone will praise him. His righteousness will be like a garden in early spring, with plants springing up everywhere. So we may have lots of questions about that reading, and I'm sure that I haven't come up with an exhaustive list at all, but a couple of the things that I've been thinking of are as follows. The people that read Isaiah 1 to 39 and then contributed to the rest of this book read 1 to 39 with their lens on. What sort of lens do we put on when we are reading this reading? How do we read this? Because it's important for us to study ourselves when we're reading the Bible, to see what it is we bring to the writing. Is it always valid, what we bring to it? Or do we have misconceptions or firmly held ideas that we've gleaned over the years that aren't quite justified? Do we find these words refreshing and encouraging? Do we think they're relevant to us? Isaiah was a prophet, so I wonder what you think a prophet is. What does a prophet do? And there's no right answer to that. I mean, I think there are several aspects to prophecy, and you might have ideas about that too. So does what you think mean that you can see that there's a prophetic voice that is valid in our society today? If so, how do we get involved? Do we speak as a church? As individual Christians? What is our prophetic voice? And in this passage, who are we encouraged to think of? Who are for us the poor, the broken-hearted, the captives? There was talk in this passage of rebuilding places that have been destroyed in the past. What do we think we need to rebuild, especially as we come out of this COVID time when so many things have been pointed out as failing that we'd taken for granted? At one point in this reading, it says that people will realise that the Israelites are blessed. I wonder what it is about us that might make people think that realise that we are blessed. And I do think it's fascinating that throughout that reading, there seems to be the fact that the voice alters between a person, a human being, and God. Sometimes it seems to be a person responding to God's call, and sometimes it seems to be God's voice directly. And I wonder what that says to us and how significant that is for us. So I've given you a lot of things to think about there, and maybe a lot of other things to read as well. So I think that's enough for now, and I look forward to seeing people on Sunday night at 7 o'clock. Goodbye.